Syria, I would say, prediction number one, the Assad government is doomed. Hard to see any way it can survive, and I can't tell you, but I suspect it will be gone this year. It is losing support on a daily basis, both nationally and internationally. And there's no hope of gaining more support. The conflict is boiling down to one between Alawis, a small religion confined almost entirely to Syria, and Sunnis, the great bulk of Muslims around the world. The Alawi religion, it stems from the Sunni religion, but it's no longer Islamic. The Alawis were historically oppressed, and when they came to power in the 1960s, it was a shock to Syrians, and the Sunnis are now gaining their revenge. I believe it's a bad idea for us to intervene in any fashion, because I don't believe we should support the foul, brutal Assad government, nor should we support the extremist, violent jihadis who are trying to replace it. There's nothing in the constitution of your country or mine that requires us to get involved in every single foreign conflict. This is one where there's no one we can support. We should stay out. Egypt, if I'd spoken to you 2 weeks ago, I would say with some confidence that the military that has ruled Egypt from behind the scenes for 60 years, since July of 1952, remains in control. It came as an abrupt shock to me and many Egyptians when the new president, who has essentially no powers, fired his defense minister, who has essentially all powers. And I'm still trying to figure out what happened there. One interpretation is that Morsi, the president, really has pulled off a coup and got rid of the military after all this time. But my inclination is to think that the military is not going to go silently into the night after 60 years of enjoying the perks of power, especially the economic perks, and we will still hear from it. I don't know how, I didn't quite understand what happened 9 days ago. It's striking, but I don't think we've heard the last of it. The press tends to say that this is Morsi's show now, it's the Muslim Brotherhood, the military is finished. Not so fast. There might yet be more innings in this game. Second pair is Iran and Turkey. Iran is the great crisis of the Middle East, and possibly of the entire world, as the mullahs, the apocalyptically minded mullahs, are racing as fast as they can to build nuclear arms, pretending they're building nuclear power plants. They appear to be absolutely determined to do this, and like the North Koreans, will pay any price to achieve nuclear weaponry. Therefore, I would conclude that non-violent efforts such as economic sanctions and computer viruses are doomed to failure. They cannot work. They're a good idea, I'm not against them. It would be a fool's errand to think that this in itself would be sufficient. If the nuclear program is to be stopped, it must be stopped through force. Should force not be used, the Iranians will get their nuclear weapons. The only way to stop them is through force. But using force is not an end in itself, because the Iranians have presumably the will and the means to rebuild whatever is destroyed, whether it's superficial on the surface or deep, way down, hundreds of meters, whatever it is, they can rebuild it. And so any strike against the Iranians is temporary. I believe there should be a strike. I think the nuclear weapons in the hands of Ali Khamenei and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and their ilk is even worse than nuclear weapons in the hands of Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong or Kim Jong-il or Zia al-Haq of Pakistan. As horrible as they were, at least they were working within this world. The guys in Tehran are working in another world. And all the more dangerous for their belief that their use, the possible deployment of nuclear weapons, could lead to the end of days and the day of resurrection and so forth. Maybe they won't, but it's not something I'd like to find out. I don't want them to have nuclear weapons. Long-term, however, Iran is potentially a great ally of the West. The Iranians have suffered from over 30 years of Islamist rule under the mullahs, Khomeini, and the others. And they're sick of it. Overwhelmingly, Iranians just don't want this radical utopian ideology and are engaged in all sorts of pursuits away from the regime. And therefore, I think that when this regime is gone, it shouldn't be that long. I'm not going to give you any hard figure, but it shouldn't be that long from now. the Iranians will look to us, look to the West, look to modern life, and be eager participants in a way that no other Muslim majority country will resemble. And therefore the overturn of the Islamic Republic is important not only for the Iranians, but also for the world of Islam. It was the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 that got this thing going, the surge of Islamism, and will be, I think, another prediction. The collapse of the Islamic Republic of Iran will begin the end of the Islamist project. In Turkey, it's quite the reverse. Turkey has been a model ally of the West for some 60 years, or anyway 50 years, from the early 50s to the early aughts, but is no longer in the past 10 years. Since the election of 2002, it's had an Islamist government that is quite hostile, and increasingly so. Our governments are blind to this fact and are embracing the Turkish government at their risk. This is a hostile country with a population that is more anti-Western than any other, with a government that's increasingly bellicose. For example, vis-a-vis Iraq, Syria, Israel, and Cyprus. Iraq and Afghanistan are my third pair. These are two countries which we in the West collectively have expended large numbers of lives and huge amounts of money. The United States taxpayer is, in Iraq alone spent $1 trillion and counting. And even the United States, $2 trillion is a substantial amount. I would predict that come back in 5, maybe 10 years, you will see barely a trace of this vast Western effort led by the United States. A goodwill effort, but a forlorn effort. It is a reflection of 1945 and what we did in Japan and Germany and Austria and Italy to not take money from our defeated foe, but to invest in the defeated foe, which was a remarkable thing the United States did in the 1940s, and has become our default response to any war. We rehabilitate our enemies. Well, there are many differences between Germany and Japan on one hand and Iraq and Afghanistan on the other, and what worked so spectacularly then is a failure today. And every day you can see news that points to the failure of this effort. And finally, 2 points about policy. Western policy vis-a-vis the Middle East has been inconsistent over the past year and a half. For example, we have bombed Libya and not the Libyan government, but not the Syrian government. What's the difference there? We support the Bahraini suppression, but we are behind the rebels and demonstrators in Egypt. There's no consistency. I would offer 3 rules for consistency vis-a-vis the Middle East. One is always support our friends, natural thing to do. Our friends are the anti-Islamist, modern, liberal, secular, Twitter, Facebook generation that came out in Tahrir Square in Cairo and has been visible everywhere. But nowhere is close to achieving power. These are generally young people, but not exclusively, who look to the West for sustenance, for inspiration. And we should be true to them, we should always support them. However remote they are from power, because they are the hope of the region. It is they who eventually will bring this region out of the mire in which it is now stuck. If anyone can do it, it is them. We must invest in them and be true to them. Contrarily, we must always be against the Islamists. The Islamists are the fascists and the communists of today, the radical utopians with an ugly, barbaric vision, trying to change human nature, trying to change human society. They are always to be opposed, whether they're wild-eyed fanatics of the bin Laden sort, or smooth, silky Democrats of the Erdogan sort, the Prime Minister of Turkey, whether they live in Afghanistan or in Sydney. They must always be opposed. We don't want them around. We should never help them get to power. They are the enemy. They are the totalitarian enemy. They are the deepest enemy that we have. They represent the opposite of all that we believe in. And finally, the third is more subtle, how to deal with the dictators, whether they be monarchical dictators or other kinds of dictators, military dictators, of which there are a profusion in the region. And I would say there, our goal should be to move them gently, ever so carefully towards political participation in civil society, rule of law, minority rights, freedom of expression, the sort of things that we hold dear. And Mubarak, when pushed for his 30 years in this direction, steadily by a concert of Western states, then I think Egypt would look quite different from today, quite different from the way it does today. But we didn't. It was a spasm of effort, hasty and misguided under George W. Bush from 2004 to 2006. But had it been steady, modest, and protracted, I think we could have made a difference. Not too late. It can be done. It's too late in Syria, too late in Egypt, but it can be done, for example, in Morocco or Algeria, where the similar circumstances obtain, or Jordan or Saudi Arabia. We should always be pushing these tyrants, these nasty tyrants, greedy tyrants, to open up their societies and to let gently, carefully, modernity come in. So those are my 8 points, and I don't know how long it took, but not too long, so there's plenty of time for your responses and questions.
Thanks, Daniel. Can I just ask you one question before we go to questions here? And that is US policy towards all of this.
Oh yeah, that was my point.
That's your guess.
I'll give you 7. The 8th was about American policy. There, of course, are many issues, some of which I've touched on. Many issues in this extremely volatile region. But no one votes, or few people vote in the United States about Turkey or Iran or Egypt or Syria. The voting topic is Israel. For it, against it, this way, that way. Israel is the topic. And Israel is a very popular state in the United States. Polls show an overwhelming majority of Americans support it vis-a-vis the Arabs. But it's not uniform across the political spectrum. Conservative Republicans support it most strongly, and then Republicans writ large, and then independents, and then Democrats, and then liberal Democrats. So conservative Republicans would be about 85% supporting Israel, and liberal Democrats maybe 35–40%. Wide variation between the two sides. What we're seeing is a split in the parties on this topic of Israel. Israel is not just Israel. Your views on Israel affect your views on Syria and Iran, Iraq, and much else. It is a world view, either a warm view that sees Israel as a security asset and a moral ally, or a view that sees Israel as a repressive state and a colonial state. Those are two, the Republican, conservative Republican, liberal Democrat view, and those views are getting wider as time goes by. You can see it in the current 2 presidential candidates. Mitt Romney was 3 weeks ago in Jerusalem and gave not only a strong policy speech in terms of supporting Israel, but a moral and emotional speech in support of Israel. Israel is the bastion of Western civilization in a distant land. And the Democrats, and Obama in particular, are much cooler. Obama keeps his distance, has talked about the problem that under Bush there was no light between the United States and Israel, has picked fights with Israel. And I believe, were he to be reelected, would pick more fights, many more fights than he has in the past, because he's been constrained by the fact that Israel is popular and he's seeking re-election. So Middle East policy in general, Israel policy in particular, is as different in this case between the 2 candidates as the economy or the cultural issues is very, very wide apart. This was not so much the case 20, 25, 30 years ago, very much the case today, and I suspect it will be more the case in the future. Well, there's several possibilities. One is that he has a plane on the tarmac ready to take him to, say, Tehran, Caracas, Moscow, I don't know. Maybe his wife will desert him. Ecuador. Ecuador. We'd love the embassy Ecuador. His fair wife might leave him and abandon him and go to London, where she is a subject of the Queen. Don't know. That's one idea, that just clear out entirely. The second would be that he or his henchmen, if he's not around anymore, will retire to the Latakia redoubts of the Alawites. The Alawites are concentrated in the northwest of Syria, a province called Latakia. And it's hilly and difficult of access. But it does have the sea. The Iranians could perhaps provision it, and they could carry on for a long time. A third would be that he would carry on in Damascus to the bitter end, in the way that Gaddafi did. See himself as the stalwart warrior for his beliefs and his community. And whatever comes, comes. It is remarkable, is it not, that we can give a whole talk and not mention the Palestinians. That has not traditionally been the case. But there are two reasons for that. One is so much is going on in other arenas, and the second is that there's nothing going on in this arena. And in large part, it's due to the tender mercies of Barack Obama. He came to office intent on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And therefore, in this spirit of being more confrontational than George W. Bush was, he said to the Israelis, or more exactly, Hillary Clinton said to the Israelis, no building in the West Bank, or even eastern Jerusalem, stop. Well, this was quite a radical shift. The Israelis had been building there since the late 60s, and the Palestinians had negotiated with them since then. The U.S. has been overseeing these negotiations, and suddenly Obama says, stop. You must stop. Well, the Israelis did stop for exactly a year, not happily, but they did. But what happened as a result of Obama saying this was, on the one hand, the Israelis were resentful of Obama and ever more supportive of Netanyahu. And on the other hand, even more importantly, the Palestinian leadership, Mahmoud Abbas, said, oh, yeah, right, don't stop. And he painted himself in the corner. And there has, as a result of this Obama initiative, been no negotiations. But I would go further and argue that even if the negotiations were flourishing and meeting on a weekly basis, it will go nowhere. The negotiations are premised on the notion that in 1993 on the White House lawn, when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shook hands, Camp David Accords, the Palestinians had accepted Israel. The fight was over. Israel accepted the autonomous and eventually independent goals of the Palestinians. The Palestinians accepted the Jewish state. No, that did not happen. The Palestinians did not accept the Jewish state. They accepted it tactically, but not strategically. They accepted it for purposes of gaining the Palestinian authority, but they didn't accept it in deeper ways. If you look at school books, mosque sermons, political speeches, whatever, you'll see look at maps, you'll see no acceptance of Israel. You won't see Israel enough. You won't hear it accepted. So in fact, you have a Palestinian population that deeply resists the idea of an Israeli Jewish state. I would say 80% of the Palestinians reject this idea, and have historically, from the 1920s until the present, 80% have rejected. And the dominant political institutions of the Palestinians has rejected completely this idea of a Jewish state. And therefore, where can these negotiations go? They are futile. In fact, they've been going on since 1993, and they're futile. What have they achieved? So I would offer a different notion, which is that 20% of Palestinians who do accept Israel should be helped to grow. So it's 40%, 60%, maybe even 80%. Then there'll be a true acceptance of Israel, and then there will be true resolution of this problem. But until the majority, the large majority of Palestinians accept that Israel is what it is, it's there permanently, negotiations serve no purpose, and indeed may even be counterproductive. The easy answer to, do I see the Egyptian military as enlightened, is to say no. The Egyptian military is not enlightened. Let me give a little more history. Egypt was ruled by a constitutional monarchy until 1952. The free officers, so-called, overthrew the monarchy almost exactly 60 years ago. and they instituted military rule. All the presidents have been military. Mohammed Naguib, Kemal Nasser, Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, Mohammed Tantawi, since February 2011. They ruled from behind the scenes, but they were there. It's a military institution. All the leaders came from it. And the military, in the course of these 60 years, grew economically, and its control over the court system, over parts of the security services, and so forth. To be a colonel in the Egyptian military is to be a very happy person. You live a very good life. You are a pasha. You are a spoiled person. To be down in the ranks is not a very happy occupation at all. The free officers and the subsequent presidents have had an Islamic orientation, not terribly pronounced, but Islamic. And it's under their rule in the last 60 years that Egypt went from being a reasonably secular society to being a very Islamist one. You may have seen the interesting features on the internet of the graduating class from Cairo University in 1954 and today. In 1954, they look like they're Westerners, especially the women. Today they don't. Very, very different. Far more Westerners. The 1981 Constitution took Islam from being a source of legitimacy to being the source of legitimacy. So the military is Islamically oriented. The great conflict between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood was over which of them runs the country. And indeed, in 1954, the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to assassinate Kemal Nasser, and he banned them. And so it's been more a rivalry over power than a rivalry over ideas. And the current situation came about because in January of 2011, inspired by developments in Tunisia, the liberals, the moderates, congregated at the biggest square in Egypt, Tahrir Square, and called for the ouster of Mubarak. The military looked at this and said, yeah, good idea. Mubarak has been stealing our money. He's spread it to his cronies and his sons and the like. And worse than that, he wants his son, Kemal, the banker, to succeed him. Well, the military doesn't want a banker as president, he wants a general as president. So they took advantage of what the liberals were doing and ousted Mubarak. Just as in Tunisia, very parallel, the security establishment had taken advantage of the demonstrations against Ben Ali, the president, and got rid of him. In both cases, the whole structure remained in place. It was just a few people who were gone. And the military ruled. Now, the military, Mohammed Tantawi, the head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the field marshal, the defense minister, a big bucket of all the medals, was running it. He wasn't running it very well, but he was running it, and he was continuing the military rule. And as I said 2 weeks ago, I told you it's military rule, nothing changed. Morsi is an adornment, a decoration of the military rule. It doesn't have any powers. And I'm a bit confused as to what's happening here. Is it that Morsi has reached a deal with some of the people in the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces staff? Is there dissension among them? Are they being Machiavellian and saying, sure, Morsi, you're in charge, and taking a look at the bank account and seeing there's hardly any money left to buy food abroad. Egypt is the single largest purchaser of food abroad. Over half the caloric intake in Egypt is foreign food. Okay, Morsi, you're game. I don't know what's going on. But I would be surprised, as I said earlier, if this is the end of the story. Morsi is simply the new Mubarak, the new Tantawi, the new autocrat. I can't see how an institution that's been in power for so long and enjoyed so many privileges is something you say, sure, it's over. Something's wrong with this picture. It was signed in 1979 in March of 1979, and has now been in effect for all these decades. It is a formal peace treaty between Egyptian and Israeli governments. When Anwar Sadat returned from Washington, having signed this, there was dead silence on the streets of Cairo. It was not a popular action. And indeed, in the aftermath of this signature, one saw the level of anti-Zionism and even anti-Semitism grow substantially. I lived in Egypt for 3 years in the 1970s before this signature. I was not particularly doing political subjects. I was working on a dissertation on medieval history. But what struck me at the time was how little Egyptians were involved in the Arab Israeli. It's just not a topic that came up. The sense I got is they gave their proxy to the government to be anti-Zionist. And then when Sadat, for reasons of his own, signed this peace treaty, there was an anger and a sense of, okay, give us back our proxies. Now we have to do something about it. So indeed, the level of antipathy towards Israel, I think, grew in Egypt, or in 1994 in Jordan, when there was a parallel treaty there. And the latent hostility of Egyptians came out. And polling shows well over 90% of Egyptians see Israel as an enemy. And taking anti-Israel steps is popular in Egypt. So the treaty does exist in a formalistic way. There's almost no trade. The one trade that was guaranteed by the treaty was Egyptian sale of cyanide gas to Israel. And one fine day a few months ago, they cut it off. So there are really there's nothing left of it. If Morsi is in charge, and the Muslim Brotherhood is in charge, one can expect a more aggressive stance. In just the last few days, the Egyptians have moved armaments and soldiers into the Sinai Peninsula, which is prohibited by the treaty. So I think basically it's a piece of paper. It has no emotional, legal, political, diplomatic import. It's defunct. I think what it lays bare is that there is a fear of states, rogue states, getting nuclear weapons. You know, were Australia to get a nuclear weapon, I would not stay up at night worrying about it. So this country is not a rogue state. I do not have a leadership that is thinking about the day of resurrection, making its planning for policies. To my mind, there's a fundamental difference between democratic states and non-democratic states. And I don't really concern myself much with the policies, the armaments of stable democratic states, such as the Western ones. I do worry very much about idiosyncratic, autocratic, apocalyptic states, such as the Iranian one. So no, I don't think it's hypocrisy. I think it's common sense. Historically, the Middle East was dramatically different from Europe. With the exception of the Jewish population of Europe, there were no religious minorities to speak of. There were various Christian minorities, but no other non-Christian minorities. And the Jewish exceptionalism was a constant irritant, very troubling to the Christian majority. In the Middle East, there were historically many minorities, Jewish, Christian, and to a lesser extent others, and they were less problematic. There was a Muslim sense of confidence that the Islamic religion supersedes the prior religions. The prior religions were fine in their time, but they're vestigial. They're not really very important. They're going to disappear. So the Muslim attitude was one of confidence, arrogance even, but it did mean that communities, particularly Jewish and Muslim, while not living a splendid life, not don't mix it up with the kind of tolerance and diversity and multiculturalism that we know, was better. Put it this way. You'd rather live as a Jew in 1400 in Egypt than in France. You were part of the mainstream life. You spoke the same languages in Egypt. In France, Jews did not. Your religion was had more in common. Judaism and Islam are far more similar religions of law, whereas Judaism and Christianity, religion of faith, Judaism, religion of law, oil and water. Someone like Maimonides at that time, earlier, a couple centuries earlier, was medical doctor to the Sultan, whereas his most equivalent leading thinker in France, Rashi, was completely isolated from French culture. So historically, Islam has been more tolerant of religious minorities in Christianity, not so today, particularly with the Islamist surge, but even before it. Minorities had been fleeing. There were about 1 million Jews in the Middle East in 1945, and maybe outside of Israel, Palestine, Israel. There are now maybe 40,000. 4% of what it was. Now it's the Christians' turn. That's the expression when first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And you'll see similar, not quite as extensive, but similar diminutions in Iraq. It's about 1/3 the population of Christians what it was a decade ago. Turkey is almost depleted of Christians. The major population is in Egypt, where for the first time in history, Copts are leaving Egypt in numbers. So you have an interesting odd parallel, which is the Muslim population is growing in the West, and the Christian population is declining in the Middle East and across the Western world. The ideology behind this is by and large what I call eliminationist. It's not genocidal. It's not to kill the Christians, it's to get them out. Ethnic cleansing. And it's working. Life is becoming increasingly intolerable. There was just news today about a girl with Down syndrome in Pakistan who seems to blaspheme the Quran in some fashion. The Christian population of Pakistan. Christian population of Pakistan, which is not very large, but there is a Christian population. There's a terror what this might lead to. Some girl mentally incapacitated does something, and the whole community is in alarm over what this might lead to. This is found across the region. So it is a very bad time to be a minority, religious minority. And not just Christian or Jew. Baha'i. You don't want to be a Baha'i, you don't want to be an Alawi. You don't want to be a Shiite in a Sunni country, you don't want to be a Sunni in a Shiite country, you don't want to be an Alawi in Turkey, you don't want to, on and on and on. The discrimination, gender-based, religious, ethnic, it goes on and on and on. And some of them are rather arcane. For example, there's a class of people in Kuwait known as the Badoon, not the Bedouin, but the Badoon. Badoon in Arabic means without. These are people who arrived in Kuwait decades ago, before the oil came, never given nationality and called without nationality. They have status. They live in Kuwait, but they don't have the privileges of being Kuwaiti, though they've been there all their lives. They could be in their 80s and they're still Badoons. There's so many acts of discrimination, bias of this sort, and there's no prospect of improvement. Indeed, things are getting worse all the time. The Middle East is in general an unhappy region, full of political and other diseases. The world is becoming aware of it by virtue of the region being the center of the world in terms of landmass. If you've got the tyranny of distance, they've got the tyranny of proximity. They're close to everything. And the oil, the monotheistic religions, oil and gas, I should say, monotheistic religions. It's a hot boiling point of volatility and potential trouble. Very striking was that Putin went to Israel a couple months ago. Russian presidents, Russian heads of state don't have a history of going to Israel. And not only that, but he donned a kippah and surrounded by rabbis, went to visit the Western Wall and talked about the ancient Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Quite stunning. And I think a reflection of an assessment of how the oil and gas situation is changing in Israel, with its already existing reserves, is now about to become a power. According to some estimates, the oil shale in Israel is equivalent, hold on to your chair, equivalent to the reserves in Saudi Arabia. Imagine that. Or as one analyst put it recently, per square kilometer, Israel has more energy than any other country in the world. So it appears the Russians are adjusting to this fact. But more broadly, the Russians have tied themselves to the Assad regime, which is diminishing the status of Russia throughout the rest of the, throughout the Middle East. And it's a really dead-end policy. Is it the Orthodox Church? Historically, the French government protected the Catholics, the British government protected the Protestants, a few that were in the Middle East, and the Russian government protected the Orthodox. The Orthodox Church has been vociferous in recent months about protecting the Christians in Lebanon, i.e. standing by Assad. There's the arms market, there's the sentimental connection, very close allies. There are tens of thousands of Russians, particularly women, wives, in Syria. It's a bit unfathomable. Is it being against whatever the Western states, particularly the United States, policy is? We support the rebels, they support Assad. It's not a very intelligent policy, but it is the Russian policy, and they're going to be harmed by it, I think. China could have a much more influential position in the Middle East if it chose to, but it has such a mercantile approach towards materials and markets, and it has this theme of non-intervention, so it doesn't really have much influence. It is influential at this point, for example, by the fact that it's purchasing Iranian oil, ignoring the sanctions, but it's mercantile, they're interested in making money. Worse things to do, but it means that the political influence of China is still very modest. It could rise quickly, but at this point it's modest. But you, in a larger sense, you're referring to a problem of interpretation of states like the Iranian one, the North Korean one, the Nazi one, the Soviet one. You know, are they crazy or are they sly? There's an argument been going on for decades now about Hitler. Who exactly was he? Was he brilliant or was he crazy? It's not a topic that one can solve right here now about the Iranian leadership. But let's just put it this way, that the opposition to the Iranian building of nuclear weapons is widespread. And there's talk of attack. There are already extensive sanctions which are growing continuously. How is this a rational policy on the Iranian part to pursue nuclear weapons despite this extensive and growing opposition that could lead, that has already led to the real, the currency of the yuan dropping precipitously, to increase disaffection in the country, to a reduction in power, political, military power because of the economic woes, that could lead to an attack, say, by the United States military. How is this a rational policy? What rational group of leaders would say, despite everything, we will persevere on this path? I think a rational leadership would say, you know, this looked like a good idea, but it's getting a bit expensive. Maybe we should reconsider it. Well, let's note that they've already done it twice, in 1981 in Iraq and in 2007 in Syria. So this would be the third time, not the first. But you're not talking about operations, you're talking about morality. I'll just return to what I said before. Western state, fully democratic state like Israel. You know, I don't spend sleepless nights thinking about the Israeli nuclear program. It is a defensive program, whereas the Iranian one does keep happening. And particularly keeps me up at nights because of electromagnetic pulse. You haven't heard of it. Electromagnetic pulse is the explosion of nuclear weapons, not on the ground, but in the air, high up in the air. Were a electromagnetic, were an atomic weapon, nuclear weapon to explode in the air, this would lead to these electromagnetic pulses that would effectively destroy the vast majority of the electrical grid of the country underneath. We're 21st century countries, we depend on electricity. How far will we get without electricity? Where will our food come from? Where will our power come from? Life will be a disaster without electricity. So it's not just Israel that's at risk, we're at risk. I don't think you're quite at risk, but we certainly are at risk. I mean, they hold conferences called A World Without Israel, A World Without Zionism and America. I think that's what they mean. I don't want to find out whether they are planning to deploy weapons in this way or not. I think they are irrational. They have barbaric goals, and you know, I don't see how that has anything to do with Israel. Israel is a defensive state that's trying to live its life in normal ways. Not so Iran, not so North Korea. So I think we should be stopping these crazy states from getting nuclear weapons. Nuri al-Maliki is no Saddam Hussein. He's not a monster. But he is an autocrat. He's increasingly gathering power in his own hands. And secondly, increasingly working with the Iranians. There was a story yesterday in the New York Times about how the Maliki government is helping the Iranian government avoid the economic sanctions. The reality is that our forces left Iraq and the Iranians are still there. Our forces are about to leave Afghanistan and the Pakistanis are still there. And just as Iraq is falling under Iranian influence, Afghanistan will fall under Pakistani influence. Another prediction. I don't see how it's going. How this can be avoided. The Iranians are going to control it directly, but they have predominant influence. And we did not understand the situation. We got involved in the wrong ways, and Maliki is a result. And the high hopes of a free and prosperous Iran. The democratic spectrum is a good term. We tend to think of democracy and not democracy. And the Middle East is a good example of a exotic range of in-betweens. The least democratic state would be the Saudi state. There's only a modicum of appointed council. Essentially no democracy at all. And say Israel would be at the other end, a fully democratic state. And in between, you have all sorts of combinations. So Iran, for example, has a lively democratic process within a narrow range of assumptions. You have to buy into the Islamic revolution. And then, once you've done that, you can differ on all sorts of things. Your question is about which country? Turkey. Turkey began, modern Turkey began as an autocratic state. Kemal Atatürk ruled with an iron fist from 1923 to 1938. But in the last couple of years, he started the CHP, the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which still exists. And it initially was autocratic. And in the 1960s, the 1950s, there was a range of political participation, which grew with time. And by the 1990s, one could say that Turkey was close to being a democratic state. It still was what Turks call a deep state. The military, the intelligence services, the permanent bureaucracy, which was immovable. There still was the prospect of military intervention by the soldiers, but they didn't like what was taking place. This happened in 1960, 1970, 1980, and 1997, but Turkey was moving in the direction of full democracy. Then came the peculiar elections of 2002. In the 1981 constitution that the military wrote, in order to keep the Kurds out of parliament, they created a super high threshold for a party to enter parliament. Not 1%, not 2%, not 5%, but 10%. If you got under 10%, you didn't enter parliament. The idea was that the Kurds would never reach 10%, so this was a way to keep them out. Well, two things happened. First, the Kurds got clever and had individual candidates who then came together as a party, so that didn't work. But even more importantly, in the 2002 elections, the AKP, the Islamist party, soft Islamist, careful Islamist party, got 34% of the vote. The CHP, the Ataturk's party, got 16% of the vote. In other words, they got half between them. And the other half was thrown out because of 9%, 8%, 7%, 6%, 5%, 4%, and less. Unbelievable. So the AKP, which had a mere third of the vote, had 2/3 of the seats in parliament and ruled the roost. And ironically, in the succeeding two elections, the AKP, the Islamist vote, went up in numbers and proportions, but the seats went down because the other parties got a little more clever and started working together, and not so many votes were thrown out. I believe that, the elections have been clean so far, but I believe that the AKP, the Islamist party, is not going to lead gracefully. And I believe their popularity is going to decline, maybe as early as the next election, in which case it will be fixed. And if not that one, the one after it. I think democracy is a perilous state in Turkey. And the accomplishments of the period from the 1950s to the 1990s has been reversed. And Turkey is now in danger of becoming an autocratic state. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey than any other country. Increasingly, there are crackdowns on anyone, military, intellectual, in business, who defies the wishes of the state. And you can see, piece by piece, the freedoms have been ratcheted down, including political freedoms. Thanks so much.